And this one will be for the aggregators, but I am curious because I've always wanted to ask you. Yeah. I just want to know, how do you look back on your time at ESPN? Because I'll say this, because I always feel like there are certain people, there's not a lot, but there are certain people in sports media, you're one of them, who I feel like just cannot work for a company that's tied in with leagues. Like, you just can't do it because you want to be honest about what you're seeing. And if you're working for a company that's got deals with the NBA and the NFL, it's tough. So even when you were there that whole time, I'm like, let's see how he walks the tightrope. So I'm curious how you look back on it.
Super proud. I was there for 14 years, and I feel like I elevated that place in just a slew of ways. And that's it. I don't think that's bragging. Like, I think I look back at the ESPN experience, I'm like, I fucking killed it for those guys. There's no question. And that's it. I had the biggest column they ever had. I had the biggest book they ever had. I had the biggest podcast they ever had. And I co-created 30 for 30, and I created Grantland. And I did TV stuff. I did all kinds of things for them. And it was all in a 14-year span, and I'm really proud of it. Like, I don't have bad blood for ESPN. I look at that as like, that place elevated me, and I elevated them. So if people want to aggregate that, that's fine. But that's how I feel.
Do you regret calling Goodell a liar?
No, because he lied. I mean, the Ray Rice thing, like, he wasn't being honest about it. So, look, that was a complicated situation in a whole bunch of ways, and it was 9 years ago. And, anybody I was even dealing with at the time in ESPN in 2014, I don't think one person is there at a higher up scale, because people ask me, like, are you still a bad blow with ESPN? I'm like, anyone that was in the decision-making spot when I was there, they're not there anymore. And for some of the reasons are because they probably weren't that good. Other reasons are they moved on somewhere else. But, I know Jimmy and Burke's a Holy Cross guy. Like, I know those guys. I like those guys.
Right. It's just, that's it right there, though. You can't call Goodell a liar if you're working for a company that, I'm talking about even today, that is tied in with the NFL. So you had to go out on your own just to get so your fans could get the full Bill Simmons experience. That's how I feel.
I know, but I still, and I've said this before, that was still slightly a mistake on my part, that podcast, and I wish, it was a Monday, we were racing to get it up, and I think it just was too contentious. I could have made all
But
the
you don't
Goodell
regret
points.
it, you said.
I don't regret what I said about Goodell. I'm saying we could have made like 2 small edits that would have made it just as impactful and not turned it into a me versus ESPN story. Because I thought what I was saying about Goodell was really important. I also had all these Grantland people that I really cared about. And I think that was the piece that from the minute it started going, that was the part that bothered me. Because we had I don't know, 45, 50 people. We really were proud of all the stuff we were doing. And we were just in such a good spot. And that was like the last thing we needed. I was right about Goodell, but should I have gone as far as I should have? I don't know. Right. I wish, like, in retrospect, to put people that worked with me, then they're stressed out. They're like, is he going to get fired? If he gets fired, is this site going to exist? Like that's just stuff like, that's where as you get older, and I'm now officially old, like I'm almost in my mid 50s, but sometimes you can learn lessons even when you're in your mid 40s. Like, is this worth it? Or what are you trying to accomplish by doing this? How far do you want to go? And what is the collateral damage? And I think my mistake with that one was not seeing in the moment the possible collateral damage.
Yeah. Now, one thing that came up when I did research, which I had forgotten about. I remembered it after I saw it, but I had forgotten about it at the time. And I remember thinking, I said this at the time, and I'll say it again. I can't think of anything more degrading for a person who's in a high-level position than calling an adult and saying you're suspended from Twitter. But you had gotten suspended from Twitter at one point. Here's what I want to know about that. What is that phone call like? Like, you have this executive in his 50s or 60s probably calling you like, Bill, you're suspended from Twitter. I mean, could you really are you serious with that? I mean, how pathetic.
Well, Twitter was at a different point of Twitter where I think they were a little fearful of, you have to remember what ESPN was like for basically the first 4 decades, right? It was like ESPN was the platform. They controlled everything. The only time you heard from talent was when they were on ESPN or if they gave an interview to somebody or like Jim Miller's book. That was it. And all of a sudden Twitter, especially early days of Twitter when people were, I mean, some of the 07, 08, 09 tweets that people had are like insane when you look back. And it was just different. It was almost like a giant message board with no consequences. And I think they were having a real trouble trying to figure out how to police it. So I think I got suspended twice. The first time was 09 when I was doing my book tour, and one of the local stations, this guy that I couldn't stand was taking shots. I just fired back with both barrels, and then they were like, "Hey, lay off Twitter a couple days." I'm like, "Fine." The second time though was the first take thing, and that was one too where I really felt like my heart was in the right place, and I don't regret what I said. But on the other hand, like my friend Horowitz was producing First Take at the time. It turned into this whole thing of the way it got aggregated. It was really instructive to me. But I still felt like I was right. Like, I really genuinely cared about elevating that place. And if you look at the stuff, especially from 09 to 2015 that I did, I was trying to make that place great. Like, I really felt like I was on the 27 Yankees, and I wanted us to be great. And I saw something like that where they just pitted Richard Sherman against Skip Bayless, so Richard Sherman could just kind of lay into him for 10 minutes. And I'm like, what is this? Is this what we want to be as a company? And now you think 10 years later, like, part of it is what they want to be as a company. Because now if something like that happened, it would immediately be leading the front page, ESPN.com. It would be like Sherman lays into Skip Bayless, and they kind of dabble in that stuff in a much more aggressive way than they did.
Yeah. Is it wild to you to see now ESPN letting their personality? I mean, what Stephen A. Smith does is wild. Like, he's on First Take, but then he has his own podcast where he's, salivating over the bachelorettes and giving out dating advice. And obviously now they have McAfee. I mean, this is not your dad's ESPN anymore. Is it wild to you to see the transformation?
It's wild and it isn't, because I think when your business is changing and you don't know how it's changing and how to necessarily keep winning, you start taking bigger chances and bigger gambles. And right now, one of the gambles they're making is to build around big personalities. When I was there, it was a combination, especially like the last 5-6 years, it was a combination of let's lock in big people, but also let's really try to develop talent. And let's try, like, you look back at the people we had at Grantland the first 4 years, right? Just Grantland as an example, because there were others, because Ride Home found a bunch of people, and we were finding talent all over the place. But Grantland, the people we had looking back, it's fucking nuts. Just 10, 12, 13 people who ended up becoming much bigger names, and whether it was writing or on TV or video or podcasts, whatever. We really cared about that. Skipper cared about that as a company. And I think ESPN, from a development standpoint, it seems less focused on it. Now, part of that can be you don't have the people who are good at finding up and coming talent. I think that's something that Grantland and The Ringer, like, I feel like we've been the best at. And maybe they just aren't as focused on it, or they don't have the right people. But it becomes, you become a baseball team where you become like the Steinbrenner Yankees, where you're like, where we'll win free agency.
Yeah.
And it's smart. They have the Buck Aikman thing was brilliant. This Manning cast has worked out really well for them. So they're spending their money on smart things for the most part, but it feels a little different.
Yeah. Do you, I mean, listen, everyone knows you as the diehard Celtics, diehard Patriot. Would you consider yourself a sports media nerd? Do you like following all this stuff with the broadcasters and the radio shows and the hot take shows? Do you follow that extremely closely? Do you get into that?
Give me an example.
Well, all right. Let's start here. NFL announcers. You have your favorites and the people, like some people, which blows me away, will say like, oh, I don't pay attention to the announcers, or the announcers don't affect my enjoyment or non-enjoyment of it. I'm like, I don't know where you're coming from, because like I can give you something on every NFL announcer. So let's start with that. You have a favorite crew in the NFL?
I'll tell you that Brian Curtis is probably listening to this right now and laughing because he's the person I text about announcers all the time. I do love this stuff, but this was in my DNA from when I had my column 25 years ago. Yeah, I have a lot of announcer thoughts. The studio show stuff, I'm just confused by. It was one of the reasons we created the Wise Guys show for FanDuel TV, because we were like, there's no studio show for people like me that like football. They put the CBS one as 6 people this year, which I think is hilarious. I've done those shows. 4 is like a lot. Yeah. You can do it. You need a traffic cop or you need to be able to really share the ball. But 4 is kind of the max. When it was 5 and it's like a 4-minute, 5-minute segment, it just doesn't work. And I think you could say this for podcasting too. I think part of the problem with content is most of the people that decide how to do content aren't people that ever did content.
Right.
So they're like, we have this 5-person, your CBS, we have this 5-person studio show. That's a lot of people. We can get JJ Watt. Well, he's great. We got to get him. Well, who are we going to bump from the show? Nobody. And then now you have 6 people. Yep. And all that does is tell me that nobody who is in charge of that has ever done anything, TV, podcast, anything, because a 6-person show is like literally impossible. So I enjoy the stuff like that. It's funny to me that the same mistakes are made over and over again. We're like, we learned from Jerome Bettis is a good example. I think Jerome Bettis should have been good on TV. They took Jerome Bettis, he retired. They threw him on a studio show right away. And this is what happens over and over again. The people, they have no training, they have no reps at all, and they're just kind of thrown into the fire. I've done that stuff. I got thrown on PTI in 2009. I was fucking terrified. And Kornheiser, who's like one of my favorite people who ever lived, he threw me on his back and he carried me for 4 days. I was terrified. I didn't know what camera to look at. I didn't know how I was doing. And they're telling me like, you're doing great. You're doing great. I'm like, I know I'm not doing great.
When did you feel like you got comfortable doing it? How long did it take you to where you weren't terrified?
The NBA show, the countdown. I felt like, I remember I went back and I did PTI 3 months before I left ESPN. And I had gotten a whole bunch of reps at that point from Countdown. And especially like the first season in Countdown, we went hostless, which was really fun. And it's the way they should do those shows. And I ended up, Wilbon would take us in, but I would end up bringing us in and out. And I kind of learned how to do TV during that season, which was weird because it was on television, with a massive audience. But I got reps. So I went back and I was like, I really want to do PTI again because I don't think Kornheiser knows that I know how to do this now.
Right.
So the first day we did it, and I was like, I brought it. Like I was like a game 7 for me. I'm like, I'm gonna be fucking good on this PTI. And he was kind of surprised. Like I could see it. And then after the show, he's like, wow, that was totally different. And we were doing a Tuesday show too. And now I know Kornheiser, and I'm like, I know he's gonna bring it tomorrow. Now I gotta be more ready. So we did the Tuesday show. And it was great. It was like as good of a PTI as you're going to have. And we were just like back and forth, boom, boom, boom. And it was exactly how you should do it.
But do you feel like it made sense then for them to throw you on in the beginning when you were terrified and you had no experience? It's almost like you needed it to start out that way in a way. No?
My theory on this is yes. I think for something repetitive shows like that, yes. Because you have to get the reps somehow.
Right.
I think when you're an athlete coming off the field or the court, and you're just getting thrown onto a studio show with people who have been doing it forever. We saw this with Shaq. Shaq seemed unrecoverable after the first year. If you remember, he got thrown in with Barkley and Kenny and Ernie, and he was terrible. And I think even Shaq would probably admit now that he was terrible. And it took, I would say, 3 years for them to figure out what to do with him and vice versa. But that's the thing with reps, and you have to have so much time to especially if your stuff doesn't work right away or the show doesn't work or whatever. Sometimes it takes years. Like I watched it happen with Kimmel. It took Kimmel 4 years, 5 years to be good at hosting his own show. And I think even he would admit that now. He was good at certain things, but he didn't know how to save jokes when they didn't work. He wasn't standing in front of the audience. Like if you watch the tape of him in 2004 versus now, it's a different guy. But he got the reps and he figured out what he needed to do. And I think with sports, we don't think about that enough. They'll just we're throwing this person in, and you'll have the rare successes like Greg Olson, but most of the time you won't.
That's why I think it's brilliant that Brady is taking the year off before he goes to Fox.
Take 10 years off.
And you see, so you're in the camp that he's not doing it.
Yeah, it's a growing camp. We have supplies for a couple of years, and we have campers and RVs and beds. I would see him.
I would make a wager that he does it starting in September if you want to wager. He's going to do it.
Is this going to be one of those things that gets aggregated? Simmons says Brady will never do Fox.
Definitely, because I had Troy on last week, and Troy's like, I spoke to Tom. He's definitely doing it. So
I'll believe it when he's doing it. Because
the
way that it happened,
because he's there. If you listen to his show on Sirius, he's there every week watching these games, studying everything. Like he's preparing for this job. So I think he's. Hey, listen, something happened. If something happens in his personal life, who knows? With his kids, he wants to be a dad. Arena Shaikh wants him to move. I don't know, but I think as of now, he's definitely doing it, and I think he's preparing hard to do it.
The reason I'm dubious is because when they announced it, it was right where the Fox upfront. See, this is how you know I follow the bigger picture media stuff.
Yeah.
It was that Fox upfront stuff, and they kind of needed something extra. And it was like, we've signed Brady, and here's the number. And I don't even think the deal was done. I think they just wanted a Brady thing to announce. And everybody I knew in the Brady circles was like, wow, can't believe they announced that. This isn't even. And then, of course, he didn't end up doing the first season. Right. So that made me think, how real was this? So I don't know. That guy's got a great life. And ultimately, it's 22 Sundays a year. You have to prepare. You have to fly to different places. I know they're flying in private. But we'll see how it goes. I am dubious.
I think he wants to be around football. I don't think he ever wants to be away from the game. That's why I think he's going to do it too.